This video is brought to you by Babbel. Start learning a new language today. Sign up through the link below and get 50% off. More on them in a bit. On the wild north coast of Cornwall stands a ruin straight out of a fairy tale. Tintagel was once one of the most storied castles in Britain, a grand stone edifice standing guard over the Bristol Channel. Completely abandoned in the 16th century, it today exists as little more than a memory, a few suggestive stones scattered across a windswept rock. But that's only the physical remains. In the realm of myth and legend, Tintagel stands as proud as it ever did. That's because this ruined castle is said to have been home to one of the most famous Britons of all. According to legends, it was at Tintagel that King Arthur was born. Possibly mythical, possibly semi-historical figure, King Arthur is said to have lived in the period immediately following Rome's withdrawal from Britain. Depending on the telling, he was either conceived at Tintagel, born there, or ruled from within its walls. But what does the archaeological record say, and how did this Cornish castle come to be so associated with Arthurian legend? Well, today, Geographics is headed back to an era of myth and magic, and uncovering the truth of King Arthur's castle. Today, the rock at Tintagel looks so imposing it's almost impossible to imagine a castle not sitting atop it. And that may be why there's such a controversy about when the first fortification appeared there. We know that during the Iron Age, the area around Tintagel was extensively mined for tin, perhaps Cornwall's greatest historical export. As a result, there's a ton of speculation that a fort may have existed on the headland to protect the mines. If so, it would have not been dissimilar to other Iron Age forts that existed up and down the Cornish coast. But this speculation has never gone beyond being just that. Speculation. We don't actually know for sure if Tintagel was used for anything in the dim and distant past, just as we don't know for sure if the Romans had anything to do with it. Sure, there are some signs that the Romans were at least in the general area. Odd coins have been recovered alongside some pottery. There even exist two Roman honorific markers, one referencing Emperor Caesar, Galerius, Valerius, Licinius, who reigned from 308 to 324 AD. But there's a big difference between the Romans actually being at Tintagel and simply being nearby. While we've read some claim a Roman fort probably existed on the site, the general consensus seems to be that the Romans saw Tintagel as just another headland, another wet, godforsaken rock on this wet, godforsaken island that they were forced to call home. It's only once the Romans left that this rain-swept headland became significant. After Roman rule ended in Britain in 410 AD, the former province disintegrated into separate kingdoms. One of the greatest was Dumnonia, a Celtic kingdom straddling the whole of modern Cornwall and Devon, plus parts of Somerset, or the long bit sticking out just under Wales for those not up on their English counties. Dumnonia spent centuries as a major player in northern Europe. We know that the Dumnoni traded far and wide, with a network that extended right the way across the Mediterranean to the Byzantine Empire, coming at a time when average sailing speed was around 4 knots, or bloody slow in layman's terms. This was all sorts of impressive. But most impressive of all may have been Tintagel. Around 450 AD, not long after the kingdom of Dumnonia had established itself, building work began on the headland. Before long, it was a thriving trade centre that could equal any other British settlement. At its height, Tintagel is thought to have been more populous than London. Luxury goods were brought here from all over Europe. Archaeologists have found pottery from the eastern Mediterranean, glass from Turkey and Cyprus, and amphora fragments suggesting huge quantities of wine and olive oil. And if you're wondering, well, how huge, just know this. There have been more amphora fragments uncovered at Tintagel than across the rest of Britain combined. In short, Tintagel under the kings of Dumnonia was an early Middle Ages boomtown, a Dubai of post-Roman Britain. Like Dubai, it was fabulously wealthy, and like Dubai, it was built upon a single natural commodity, in this case, Cornish tin. But while Dubai seems to be in a state of never-ending expansion, Tintagel would soon reach its limits. In just 2 short centuries, this wealthy port would vanish into utter obscurity. Before we get on to the collapse of the first Tintagel, let's take a moment to poke around and get a bit of a sense of the place. The first thing you have to understand is that it wouldn't have appeared all that impressive to anyone alive today. While Tintagel was fabulously wealthy for the time and place, it was also a post-Roman settlement. That meant no graceful columns, no vast temples, no gladiatorial arenas. In fact, were you to leap in a time machine and inexplicably choose 6th century Cornwall as your first destination, you'd encounter a Tintagel that looked like a village. Large wooden fences would have enclosed the narrow strip leading from the mainland. On the headland proper, some 100 squat buildings would have stood among small gardens. But make no mistake, for anyone actually from 6th century Britain, Tintagel would appear like the centre of the world. English Heritage estimates it was the biggest urban centre in Britain for maybe 200 years. But rather than expressing the area's usefulness as a port, this size also expressed something else: power. During their state's existence, the kings of Dumnonia moved about their land, constantly switching their courts between many royal sites. It's been theorized that Tintagel was one of the strongholds they frequently stopped in, and likely the greatest of them all. That would certainly explain the Great Hall that once stood here, where we now know vast amounts of luxury food and drink were consumed. It would also explain the weird, foot-shaped hollow chiseled into the rock at Tintagel's highest point. It's been suggested this played a key part in ceremonies for inaugurating new kings. The royal aspect might also explain Tintagel's location. A desolate promontory battered by storms, Tintagel is useful for guarding ships, but not much else. With such a narrow natural bulge connecting it to the mainland, it's almost willfully awkward, unless you start to think in terms of kings living here. Suddenly, that narrow bridge begins to look a whole lot more like an easily defendable entrance. Those rough storms are just an extra hindrance to enemy kings landing their boats. And defense could very well have been on the kings of Dumnonia's minds. Monumental stones with Irish inscriptions litter parts of northeast Cornwall and the Tamar Valley, perhaps suggesting hostile colonists were moving onto their turf. But it wouldn't be invasion that ultimately doomed the first Tintagel, but something far more prosaic: time. As the 7th century dawned, Tintagel was still important. The stone from this era, inscribed with Latin, Celtic, and Greek, shows it remains a vibrant multicultural port. Yet between the dawn of the 7th century and the beginning of the 8th, this vibrant port was completely abandoned. It's frustrating today, not knowing exactly what happened. Dumnonia itself existed right the way up until the 9th century, so conquest is out of the window. But then, well, what? What could have driven a major urban centre to just be deserted like that? And the reality is, we may never know. But while Tintagel, the settlement, may have crumbled away, its memory lived on. In fact, it is folk memories of this once grand royal port and its great hall that would soon influence the most famous British folktale of them all: the legend of King Arthur. By 814 AD, Dumnonia was no more, conquered by Egbert of Wessex. By that point, Tintagel had stood empty for well over 100 years, and this was just the start. It would be another 3 centuries before the wider world paid any attention to Tintagel again. But even as the former trade centre fell into lifeless ruin, the stories that would make it famous were already being told. Today, tracing the origin of the Arthur myth is a discipline in and of itself. The first concrete source we have for the fabled British king is a 9th century monk called Nennius, but he may well have been drawing on the work of others. In fact, it's still not totally settled whether there really was an Arthur who really did lead the Britons against a Saxon invasion. If he did exist, this Arthur was likely a 6th century warlord, someone whom the post-Roman Britons turned to in a dark time, elevating his exploits into myth. But the Arthur you know was all the work of a single man. Geoffrey of Monmouth was to history what Michael Bay is to movies, a producer of trash par excellence who was nonetheless hugely popular. In his History of the Kings of Britain from circa 1135, Geoffrey took all the early writings on maybe real Arthur and turned them into a myth that would last for centuries. An important part of that myth involved Tintagel. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's telling, Tintagel is a splendid castle owned by Gorlois of Cornwall. It's also where Gorlois keeps his wife Egbert locked up, having learned that Britain's horny king, Uther Pendragon, is itching to get in her pants. Apparently being the Dark Ages equivalent of Quagmire, Uther tries to get into Tintagel regardless, only to be stopped by the sheer cliffs and narrow isthmus. Luckily for Uther Horndog, Merlin uses magic to make him look like Egerna's husband. Uther waltzes into Tintagel unopposed and has sex with Egerna, and King Arthur is conceived. And that really is medieval legends, everyone. They are full of sexual assault that you're just meant to kinda be okay with. Creepy origin stories and dubious historical value aside, Geoffrey of Monmouth's book was a smash hit. It's from his writings that the modern Arthur myth arose. Yet nobody knows why he set such a pivotal scene at Tintagel. Of all the possible candidates for a historic Arthur, none is known to have had any links to the ancient port. Instead, the association seems to have arisen in a completely different way. We know that Geoffrey of Monmouth mixed a number of folktales into his history. It seems likely that the tales from Cornwall resolved around the lost Tintagel, once the centre of a mighty trading kingdom. As the centuries passed, the Tintagel in those tales grew mightier in each retelling, until it seemed only natural the greatest myths would all have some connection to it. In the same century as Geoffrey's book, French and German poems about Tristan and Isolde began placing the action at Tintagel, said to be the castle of King Mark of Cornwall. It seems then that the Tintagel of Dumnonia was so powerful that it left a kind of echo through time, one that got absorbed into oral legends that were then transmitted across northwest Europe before themselves being repurposed by writers in the high medieval era. But while Tintagel's afterlife in myth is testament to just how mighty it once was, the story wouldn't stop there. In the near future, this one-time royal stronghold would find itself being resurrected from the pages of fiction and brought back into the real world. And just before we get into it being brought back, let me tell you about today's fantastic sponsor, Babbel. Now, there are lots of reasons you might need to learn a new language: professional, personal, maybe you're just going traveling. Lots of reasons. Now, you might have had a crack at this with some basic free apps from the App Store, but Babbel does away with the basics. Indeed, it's the #1 language learning app in the world, with 14 different languages currently available. So why is Babbel better than the rest? Well, with Babbel, you can count on people who have actual experience teaching you the language, rather than just relying on machine learning like other apps. It's also totally ad-free, so distraction-free. That way you can just focus on the learning. It'll also focus on language for real life, teaching you for situations you'll actually encounter. They've got an app as well, so it's really easy to just jump in and practice whenever you have a down moment, and those few short minutes of practice really do all add up. All very nicely designed and easy to use, so start learning a new language today with Babbel. Get 6 months for 50% off through the link below, and let's get back to it. The century or so after the publication of Geoffrey of Monmouth's book saw the Arthur legend go supernova. Across Europe, Arthur was held up as the Christian ideal of a ruler: wise, chivalric, brave. Despite plenty of old Jeff's contemporaries being like, dude, he's clearly making this up, people totally believed that it was real. One of those suckered in by this medieval fake news may have been Richard of Cornwall. The younger brother of King Henry III, Richard got his title in 1225 when his big bro just straight up gave him Cornwall. At the time Richard was gifted Cornwall, Tintagel was much as it looks today, a desolate headland dotted with ruins. But Richard wasn't content to leave it like that. He'd grown up seeped in Arthurian myths, absorbing all the stories until they seemed as real to him as any factual tale. No, he had other plans for his new county. In May 1233, Richard purchased the islands of Tintagel from some dude called Gervase, swapping 3 of his grand manors for this tiny headland. He then began a construction project that would change Tintagel's history. Like a bonkers American billionaire building themselves a replica of Versailles to live in, Richard built a brand new Arthurian castle at Tintagel. By now, there was no need for a defensive structure in Cornwall, and Richard seems to have known this. The walls of his castle were thin, made of slate, and deliberately constructed to look as old and as romantic as possible. As an actual fortification, it was utterly useless. But Richard wasn't building a castle to do traditional castle-y things. He was building one to live out his childhood dreams. Under Richard's watch, vast walls unfurled along the edges of Tintagel's cliffs, Gatehouses sprung up, great courtyards were built surrounded by luxury living spaces. At the back of it all, a new great hall came into being, one so grand that the kings of Dumnonia would have been sick with envy. From a real historic ruin, Richard transformed Tintagel into a Disneyland version of Arthurian legend, a medieval fantasy straddling the horizon. It was both hugely expensive and hugely pointless, the grandest of follies. Or was it? The most common interpretation of Richard's decision to rebuild Tintagel is that he was simply an Arthur nut. The evidence is certainly there. The myth was super popular at the time, and it's known Richard's other family members indulged in absurd Arthurian projects like rebuilding the king's supposed tomb at Glastonbury. So, yeah, it's totally possible Richard was just a guy with way too much money and a ton of weird fantasies that he just wanted to cosplay. But there is another possibility. Right up until the 18th century, Cornwall was commonly regarded as not a part of England, but as a separate country like Wales or Scotland, a place with its own language and ethnic identity. This means it might have been advisable for an outsider like Richard to play on Cornish pride, to do something to make his new role as ruler more easily acceptable. And what better way to stroke local egos than by rebuilding the greatest castle in Cornish history? There's even evidence that Richard's Tintagel was pure propaganda. Aside from one meeting there with a Welsh prince in 1242, Richard barely used his fantasy castle. In fact, once he started setting his sights on bigger things like being crowned king of the Germans in the Holy Roman Empire, he stopped visiting Tintagel altogether. It's not exactly what you'd expect from a real Arthurian fanboy. Whatever the truth of the matter, Richard's later life neglect was ruinous for the new Tintagel. Within a decade of being completed, the walls were already showing signs of instability. By the time Richard died in April 1272, his faux Arthurian castle was slowly but surely crumbling. It would be the start of Tintagel's second great period of decline. And this time, there was not going to be any coming back. 65 years after Richard of Cornwall died, the county was elevated to a duchy. As part of this process, a survey was carried out, including of Tintagel. It revealed that Richard's legendary castle was already well on its way to ruin. A description from that time describes Tintagel as a walled castle in which there are 2 decayed chambers over the 2 gateways, a decayed stable for 8 horses, a cellar, and a ruined bakehouse. It then goes on to note that the timbers from the Great Hall have all been torn down, because the hall was ruinous and its walls of no value. In other words, less awesome Arthurian castle and more decaying pile of rubble. Still, the place wasn't yet fully abandoned. There were still some workers and even a priest who doggedly held mass every morning in the crumbling chapel. So people tried to preserve it. Across the 14th century, multiple attempts were made to bring Richard's castle back to something resembling normal. Edward the Black Prince, for example, led a partial reconstruction, splitting the remains of the Great Hall into separate smaller buildings. In 1386, Richard II got in on the act, spending what was then the whopping sum of £34 to reinforce the structure, just in case the French tried to invade via North Cornwall. But the likelihood of Tintagel ever being used to ward off a French invasion was so vanishingly remote that everyone was soon looking for other uses. In the late 14th century, the castle was briefly used to house high-status prisoners, but only 2 were ever held there before it fell out of use again. By the end of the century, it was just the chaplain and a small staff left to take care of the building, but why and for who was anybody's guess. Yet even as Tintagel continued to decline, its place in legend grew. In 1480, the antiquary William Worcester declared that King Arthur wasn't just conceived at Tintagel, but he was born there. It was the start of an expanding Arthur myth that would see more and more of the king's life associated with Cornwall. But even as the king of all Britons was becoming ever more connected to Cornwall, Cornwall itself was going decidedly off the rest of Britain. The first Cornish Rebellion erupted in 1497 after Henry VII removed Cornwall's devolved rights and massively jacked up taxes to finance his war with Scotland. Massive unfair taxes being a guaranteed way to piss people off, about 15,000 Cornish and Devonshire men grabbed whatever weapons came to hand and marched on London. They were promptly massacred by the king's forces, and Well, that was that. But this rebellion was only the first in a series that would make Cornwall and England into long-time enemies. In September of the same year, a Cornish force of 6,000 strong attacked Exeter in a wild plot to place the pretender Perkin Warbeck on the throne. Over half a century later, the introduction of the Common Book of Prayer caused yet another uprising after Edward VI refused to have a version printed in Cornish. Known as the Prayer Book Rebellion, this was the grimmest of the lot. Over 2,300 people were killed in the fighting. In the aftermath, the king had anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Cornish and Devonshire men executed in revenge. It's ironic that just as the English were enthusiastically embracing the idea that their greatest hero hailed from Cornwall, they were simultaneously crushing the Cornish people in bloody reprisals. Yet by now, the Arthur legend had taken on a life of its own. Before long, Tintagel's real history would be completely forgotten. In the aftermath of the Prayer Book Rebellion, the government briefly took an interest in regarrisoning Tintagel, but the time to do so soon passed, and the castle slipped back into obscurity. Come 1600, it had been completely deserted. Not even a lone chaplain remained to take care of the decaying chapel. Not long after, Cornwall staged its last great rebellion. When the English Civil War broke out, Cornwall enthusiastically supported King Charles over Parliament, a rare outlier in the die-hard parliamentary West Country. Unfortunately, what seemed to be a shrewd move in the early 1640s turned out to be a major mistake in 1646 when Parliament unexpectedly won, leaving Cornwall on the losing side. By now, being Cornish was almost synonymous with being against who was ever in control of England, and so a slow and deliberate process was begun to cleanse all markers of Cornish identity from the peninsula. Over many years, the Cornish language was marginalised and its traditions erased until Cornwall was no longer regarded as a separate country, but just a part of England. Perhaps by coincidence, this was also the era that saw Tintagel fully take over the Arthurian legend. In 1650, the now ruined castle was referred to for the first time as King Arthur's Castle. Not the place he was conceived or even the place he was born, but the place that he ruled from. In the popular imagination, Tintagel and Camelot had become one and the same. And who knows? Well, maybe they were. If it had been the great port of the kingdom of Dumnonia that inspired Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthur, then who's to say that this first Tintagel didn't also inspire the tales of Camelot? It was Alfred Lord Tennyson who finally cemented the connection. From 1859 to 1885, the Victorian poet published a gigantic pile of works known as the Idylls of the King, basically the War and Peace of Arthurian poetry. The Idylls were so barnstormingly popular and so linked to Tintagel that the public went nuts. By the late 19th century, Richard's ruined castle had become a major tourist attraction, and it has stayed that way ever since. Today, Tintagel Castle is one of English heritage's 5 most visited sites, recording around 250,000 visitors every single year. To put that in perspective, the far more ancient UNESCO-listed Newgrange in Ireland gets only 200,000. It seems sort of unfair somehow. Yet while Tintagel may not really be a relic of the past, while its connection to the legend of King Arthur may be dubious, there's no denying the site's power. It was here, some 1,500 years ago, that one of the greatest Celtic kingdoms in British history reached its zenith, building a port so powerful it could rival anywhere in northwest Europe. That port's life may have been brief, but it left behind an image, one that made its mark into folk memory. An image of a shining castle above the sea, a place so perfect that later writers could only assume it must have been Camelot. Maybe the Arthurian connection is spurious, but in its own way, Tintagel's history is even more fascinating than the legends it inspired. Hopefully, after this video, you feel the same way too. So I really hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, please do smash that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and please do check out our fantastic sponsor for this episode, Babbel, who I'm linking to below. And thank you for watching.